This is OTR FM, part of the IOM Radio Network.
Welcome to Cracked, the podcast, the program that slays the dragons of mental health by stripping away the shame, embarrassment, fear, and stigma. Because mental health isn't something that affects just some of us, it applies to all of us. Here to shine a new light on areas of mental health that often go unvisited are your hosts, Rebecca Shaper and Sandy Sedgbeer.
Hello, and welcome to Crack the Podcast, Slaying the Dragons of Mental Health with me, Sandy Sedgbeer.
And me, Rebecca Shaper.
For people struggling with anxiety, depression, PTS, and other mental health issues, happiness and joy can be elusive states of mind. But today we're going to learn how the simple but profoundly effective emotional freedom technique can reduce anxiety, stress, and PTS, and remodel your brain for resilience, creativity and joy. And with us to share the science behind EFT is award-winning author, researcher and humanitarian Dawson Church, PhD, who founded the National Institute for Integrative Healthcare to promote groundbreaking new treatments, and whose largest program, the Veteran Stress Project, has offered free treatment to over 20,000 veterans with PTS over the past decade. Dawson Church, welcome.
It is such a pleasure to see you again, Sandy, and to be here with you, Rebecca. And I can't wait to plunge in and just share how much hope and joy and possibility there is in this field right now.
Well, every time I see you, you're always brimming over with health and joy. And I love that. You're a great advertisement for your product. So tell us now, I know that you earned a doctorate in integrative healthcare under the mentorship of Norm Shealy, the neurosurgeon, and you have a postgraduate PhD in natural medicine, a clinical certification in energy psychology, and of course, as I said, you founded the National Institute for Integrative Healthcare. What I want to know is, where did this interest in integrative healthcare and alternative medicine start for you?
Sandy, it arose from the depths of despair. Like many of us, I was just so broken and so miserable, I had to fix myself. I remember I tell the story in my book, Bliss Brain, and I hadn't really disclosed a lot of the autobiographical details of this before. But when I was 15 years old, I had this pivotal moment in my life when I was walking past a full-length mirror, and I stopped and just looked at myself. 6'6", I had long, curly brown hair halfway down my chest, and I was wearing these bell-bottom jeans. I mean, this is a long time ago. Had a leather bag of books slung over my shoulder, which was with me all times. And I looked at this person in the mirror that was me, and this thought flashed into my mind: that's the saddest face I've ever seen. I was so miserable. I was just, as a teenager, so miserable. And I was suicidal. I was depressed. I was so depressed that people just avoided me. They just didn't want to be around me. And so it began there. At that year, I went and lived on a spiritual community. I lived on and off on spiritual communities for many years after that. I studied psychology. I looked at ways of fixing myself. And so it all began out of just recognition that I was in terrible shape. And then I did make progress with meditation, with energy healing. We read what's called the perennial philosophy, Alan Watts called the perennial philosophy that underlies all religions. And so I learned a lot of these ideas. But what I never was able to do was get a lot happier. I became a little bit happier. And then when I discovered energy therapies, I began to get a lot happier. And meditation really was a cornerstone of this as well. I learned to meditate early, but when I made the commitment to daily meditation every single day, that's when everything began to change. So that's why I teach these techniques, because I know I've been in that that depressed, suicidal, miserable daily state. And I want to let people know, I want to scream and yell about how good it is to not be there anymore and to wake up every morning so full of love and joy and compassion and gratitude, you don't know where to put it all.
Yeah.
Wow. So how long of a journey did it take you to finally get to that point where you felt solid within yourself and you knew you were happy within yourself? If that makes sense.
Yeah, and I have a section in chapter 1 of Bliss Brain that the subtitle in chapter 1 is From 50 Years to 50 Seconds. And what I mean by that is it took me about 50 years. So I'm in my mid-60s. It took me a long, long, long time to figure out a lot of these things, to read the science. I've been doing experiments myself now for about 20 years. And so it's taken a long, long time. And then what I do when I teach, like I teach 7-day retreats. We get together with people either in person or virtually, and we do these intensive exercises for 7 days. When we do them in person, we often have a team of neuroscientists there, and they will hook up people to EEGs and will actually read their brain waves.
Wow.
And we'll read their brain waves on day 1 and on day 7. And initially, day 1, their brain waves are all scattered, and the analogy I use is light. A 60-watt light bulb is so useful. It's not in phase, it's not coherent light, but that 60-watt light bulb will light up your room. But if you take that same 60 watts of light and put it in phase and make all those light waves coherent, that's a laser. And that 60-watt laser will cut through a sheet of steel. And that's the power of coherence. And so we train people to bring their brain waves into coherence. Now, if you do this the traditional way, like I did, and go and join an ashram, maybe go to a monastery or a convent and spend 10,000 hours, you pretty much got coherence figured out after that time. What we're finding, though, is that people in a 7-day retreat using neuroscience can learn it in a very short period of time. It doesn't take 10,000 hours. And then one of our people in our last retreat, we hooked her up on day 7, and she was there in 47 seconds. Literally, she closed her eyes and she let go of all that suffering and all that self-preoccupation that characterizes people's usual experience. And she was in Bliss Brain in 47 seconds. That's why that section is called From 50 Years to 50 Seconds. So it took me 50 years. But what neuroscience is showing us now is that with the right techniques, and I list them in Bliss Brain, I also give people meditations in the book. Use these meditations. We know that they will shift you into that elevated emotional state. And it doesn't take 10,000 hours of practice. You can learn to do it in a few days, and then you're in bliss in a minute or less.
Wow.
Dawson, when did you discover EFT?
Yeah.
Around 2000, shortly after I made the commitment to daily meditation, and I began to get into energy therapies like Don Eden, energy medicine, James Oshman, the famous biologist, and really learn from these people, Norm Shealy, my mentor. And so I began to get into these various techniques, but I picked EFT to research. And it was a big decision. Should I pick thought field therapy? Should I pick energy medicine? Should I pick EFT? I chose EFT because it's a gateway drug. It's easy. And at that point, there were 1 million people or so using EFT. Now, estimates are there are like 30 million people worldwide using EFT tapping. But it's just really easy. You can do what we call a round routine of EFT in under 2 minutes. And then we watch people's, like those over 20,000 veterans we worked with, we watch their levels of grief and anger and resentment and all the negative emotions just dropping away. One young veteran I worked with had served 4 tours of duty in Iraq and had high levels of PTSD. And I asked him to think about one event which I would work with him on using EFT. And it was shortly after he arrived in Iraq. One of his friends had been killed. And this young man was a combat medic. And one of his jobs was to clean the uniform of this friend of his who had been shot. And the uniform had dried blood and body fluids over it. It smelled terrible after a few days in the Iraqi sun. And this young man was so triggered. And we measure triggering on a scale from 0 to 10. So 10 out of 10, he was so triggered. And when he remembered the incident, he actually had to run out of the medic hut, take a breath of fresh air because it smelled so bad in there, then run back in, do a little bit of cleaning on the uniform, run back out for a breath of air. And so, working with people like this, it's intense. And we use that EFT, basically tapping like this on acupuncture points. And so we tapped on each of the components of that terrible traumatic memory. And within a few minutes, he was totally calm. And he realized, he said, I love that friend of mine. And this was an act of service. So it went from being a memory of horror to the memory of an act of service. And that happened in just a few minutes. Later on, funnily enough, there was a TV crew present about 2 months later, and they were interviewing him and me together in the same room. And I said to him, what's your number on that event right now on cleaning the uniform? And he was still a 0. So even when we go back and do follow-up 6 months, 12 months on, people are still neutral for those traumatic events. So that's EFT. It just involves thinking about the bad stuff, tapping on acupoints, which regulates your energy system and calms the emotional brain. And then people usually recover even from these serious psychological setbacks.
Well, that kind of leads me to this next question, just what you were talking about. You performed 2 important pilot studies of EFT for PTS, which then led to a randomized controlled trial, which demonstrated that 86% of veterans with clinical PTS were subclinical after 6 sessions of EFT and remained on the follow-up. How did that success rate compare with some of the other therapies offered through veterans during stress projects?
Oh, well, if veterans go to the VA and get regular therapies, for one thing, a huge number of them drop out. So they go there and they might try group therapy, they might try exposure therapy, they might get individual psychotherapy. And one famous psychiatrist who treated a lot of veterans after World War II, his name was Joseph Walpe, and he was a Freudian analyst as well as being a psychiatrist. And so he said, well, I'm a Freudian analyst. We know the way to fix people is the talking cure. So he would lay those veterans down on a couch like a good Freudian and say, now tell me about Omaha Beach. And he wrote in his book, The Practice of Behavior Therapy, in the 1950s, he wrote that kind of treatment was not unhelpful. It was harmful. And now we have a new term coined in the 1980s, re-traumatization. If you think about a traumatic stress without release, without catharsis, without letting go, it re-traumatizes you, and then you're building those neural pathways in your brain. In one study of identical twins, one of whom had fought in Vietnam, the other of whom didn't, the researchers found that the brain pathways that carry the signals of stress were stronger in the twins that had been in Vietnam. So you're literally re-traumatizing yourself, increasing the functioning of those traumatized parts of your brain. It is essential to do something to release that traumatic stress. If you don't, you wind up re-traumatizing yourself and you wind up in worse shape than before. So conventional therapy often is working at the mental level. Now, working at the mental level, like with cognitive therapy, is really super valuable if you're working on things that are accessible by the conscious mind. If you're working with survival issues or subconscious cues of threat driving you to fight or flight, what we find is you need physical cues of safety. And if you just try and process those things cognitively by retelling your old story, often you re-traumatize yourself. So conventional therapies, there's some fantastic therapies out there. Family therapies, there are some wonderful cognitive therapies and wonderful behavioral therapies, but you need, for traumatic events, you need something that calms the body and gives the body the assurance that you're safe. And that means yoga, it means breath work, it means EMDR with eye movements, it means EFT. Those are the most successful therapies for traumatic stress.
Wow, that's very interesting.
Very impressive. Dawson,
Yes.
How does EFT work? What is happening when you are tapping these acupressure points?
It is so cool to stick people into MRIs, which we're doing now. And it's complicated and expensive to do an MRI study or an EEG study. And so we've done a few of them, and watching their brains literally change as they're in the MRI is absolutely amazing. And so what you find is that you stick people in the MRI scanner and you say, okay, remember that childhood assault that happened when you were 4 years old. And that the person remembers, and the whole emotional midbrain, the whole emotional brain lights up. And in MRI studies, usually lights up means becomes red. We have a kind of a scale in MRI studies where yellow, orange, red is highly active brain activity. And then light blue, dark blue, purple, that's low brain activity. So you put people in an MRI, they think of a stressor, a bad event from their past, and their emotional midbrain gets all lit up. It gets red. Then you offer them EFT. You work with them on that issue with EFT. They go back in the MRI. You have them think of the same event, but now the brain is calm and neutral. They no longer go into the stress response, so it calms the emotional midbrain. Not only that, in time, as we build up that habit of being calm, we actually create new neural tissue in those parts of the brain. So the brain learns that this event from 4 years old is not a threat to my current survival. I'm okay right now, and that's what counts. So we relearn. There's a whole new field called memory reconsolidation and extinction. We reconsolidate those memories, whereas before they were threatening cues. We thought about the 4-year-old assault. We went into fight or flight. Now we reconsolidate that memory. And like one therapist I worked with on stage at Omega Institute let us film her. She stood up after a session and she said, I am strong. I am resilient. Underneath all the abuse, I was happy then. I'm happy now. So you find a self, a version of self, after you release that traumatic stress, that core of you that is strong and resilient, and then you start to build the brain tissue of resilience, which is why resilience is one of the 3 characteristics in the subtitle of my book, Bliss Brain: resilience, creativity, and joy. You literally build a resilient brain.
Well, have you ever run into anybody who has had such a severe traumatic experience that they're so blocked that they cannot remember, that the experience was just so horrific? And what happened? What happened?
There are people I've worked with, and Rebecca, sometimes, like one woman sat down in the chair, because I do a lot of workshops, like a lot of week-long workshops, weekend workshops, and one woman sat in the chair opposite me, telling me a story in front of a big audience, and she said, described a horrendous history of childhood abuse, sexual abuse, her whole early life, and then she was raised in a cult. And then when she was 15 years old, she realized she was gay. She came out as lesbian publicly, and then they ejected her and shunned her. She lost all her friends, lost all her family at the age of 15. And then she'd had a series of tragedies over the course of the next few years and the rest of her life. She was in her mid-50s when I worked with her. And sometimes with people like that, I sit there listening to them, and I'm listening empathetically. But in my mind, I'm asking the question you were asking, Rebecca, is can this person ever heal? I mean, so much abuse, so much trauma. And often people surprise me. Like she surprised the whole audience. And what happened was as she worked with me, you just literally see layer after layer after layer after layer after layer of trauma falling off her body. Her body began to become animated. Her face became mobile. Somebody said, Dawson, we should be taking photographs of people on day 1 and day 7 of your retreats because their faces change as all these layers of trauma fall off. So I have found people surprising me, even when I thought the trauma was too great for them. Now, I will say that we have 48 clinical EFT techniques, and the first 9 of them are just regular tapping. They work for a lot of things, but if you're dealing with an issue like persistent patterns of self-sabotage in your relationships to do with your health or your weight, if you're working with psychological trauma, it's really important to get proper support from a therapist, from a trained practitioner, because you don't want to be venturing into that dark territory by yourself. So EFT is a self-help technique, works great for doing it on your own issues, but if you're dealing with trauma, it's essential to do it yourself. There are also some specialized techniques for pre-verbal trauma. You can't really address pre-verbal trauma that happened really early in life in verbal ways. You need body-based ways. And then there's prenatal trauma. There's an amazing video that my friend Bruce Lipton plays in his workshop sometimes of a sonogram of a baby in the womb. And this baby is just there in the womb, floating in the amniotic fluid, happy as can be. And then the mother and father have an argument and start screaming and yelling at each other. And you see the baby is just like jumping up and down, getting so stressed. Cortisol is entering the womb. So when that client winds up in your practice, in your Zoom room or in your psychotherapy office at the age of 40, with flashbacks and nightmares and a vague sense that their life isn't okay, trying to talk them out of that is really hard, but you can tap them out of that. So we have specialized techniques. We have eye movement techniques. We have regression techniques. We have a whole bunch of specialized techniques that our certified practitioners are trained in that will take people back to those parts of their lives. And even if they can't remember anything about the trauma, they can feel it in their bodies, and we can work with it at that pre-verbal level.
Wow.
So has anyone ever actually traced the whole pathway? You know, I'm tapping here. What is going on in my body? What is going on in my brain? Is my brain responding to something? And then that is creating different hormones and chemicals to be produced.
It is creating different hormones and chemicals. And one of my earliest studies, big studies, was cortisol. And cortisol is a really good biomarker because when you're stressed, cortisol goes up, adrenaline goes up, and then other things go down. So I began to look at cortisol, and in this particular group, we had people getting 1 hour of EFT, only 1 hour therapy session with EFT, versus conventional talk therapy, versus just taking a rest in a clinic. And we found in this large-scale, triple-blind, randomized controlled trial that the people getting EFT had twice the drop in anxiety and depression symptoms as the talk therapy or the rest groups, and their cortisol dropped almost twice as much as well. So it really shows up on biomarkers. Now, the cool thing about it is I did one study at Esalen Institute, and we looked at the relationship of cortisol to immunoglobulins. And immunoglobulins are these Y-shaped molecules. They're shaped like a Y, and they have two branches to them, and they neutralize viruses, especially coronaviruses. And these Y-shaped antibodies, if our bodies have lots of these immunoglobulin molecules, we are resilient against viruses, colds, and various kinds of environmental toxins. So bacteria, viruses, the more antibodies we have, the more resources our bodies have to fight those kinds of insults. So we measured both cortisol and immunoglobulins. And we found that in the course of a week of tapping and meditation, people's cortisol levels dropped 37%. Their antibody levels of those coronavirus fighting antibodies, their levels rose 113% in just 1 week. So when cortisol and stress goes down, all your body's resources get redeployed into rest and digest. You let go of fight or flight, then rest and digest. Your immune system improves, your digestion improves, your sleep improves. One of the first things these veterans report, like one veteran that one of my colleagues worked with, who's a psychologist, and he came in for 6 EFT sessions as part of the stress project. Came in for the first session, she did some tapping with him. He showed up for a second session, and I'm just getting chills as I say this because these stories move me so deeply. His second session, he walked in the door and said, after the first session, I got my first full night's sleep since Vietnam. That's what happens to insomnia.
Well, I've got to be honest with you, Dawson. Last night, I thought, I'll give it a try.
And
actually, I absolutely loved it. I picked the one that had the beautiful clouds in the sky above the ocean and the waves. I went, ooh, I like this one. And I did it, and I had a great night's sleep last night because I've never done it before, but I'm very interested in this. And so thank you. Yeah.
I'm so glad you tried it and saw the results. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you're listening to Crack the Podcast with me, Sandy Sedgbeer, and my co-host, Rebecca Shaper, and we're talking to award-winning author, researcher, and humanitarian Dawson Church, who founded the National Institute for Integrative Healthcare, and we're talking about emotional freedom technique, otherwise known as tapping, and its efficacy in helping people retrain their brains for resilience, creativity, and joy, and reduce anxiety, stress, and PTS. And we'll be back with more from Dawson after this break.
The Real Conscious Connection. Om Times Radio. IOM FM. Om Times Magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. A philanthropic organization, their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. Om Times, co-creating a more conscious lifestyle.
Hello, I'm Sandy Sedgbeer, host of Om Times Magazine's flagship radio show, What is Going Om. My passion is sifting through information, research, and innovations from new thought teachers, speakers, and researchers, pushing back the boundaries of what we know about life, energy, metaphysics, and the universe. I love shifting perceptions about who we are, why we're here, and how quickly impossible becomes normal when we open our minds, expand our awareness, and accept that the only limits that exist are those we place upon ourselves. So if you're the kind of forward-thinking, eager investigator of what lies beyond the current reality that most perceive, why not make a date to come play with me in the field of possibilities at 4 p.m. Pacific Time, 7 p.m. Eastern Time every Thursday, and together we can discover what's really going on.
Worried about your friend but don't know how to reach out?
You could say how are you or get a fake tattoo. You could ask with an app if it works for you. You could chat with them in VR. It's so good. If you think you should check in, yeah, you should.
Whatever gets you talking.
Reach out to a friend about their mental health.
Whatever gets you talking.
Learn how you can help at seizetheawkward.org.
Welcome back. I've just been looking at some of the messages in the chat window, and we will talk a little bit later about whether you can use tapping for physical as well as emotional. And we will ask Dawson a little bit later to give us a quick demonstration. But first, Dawson, you've published so many scientific papers in peer-reviewed journals. You've collaborated with scholars at universities. You've done all kinds of studies. And then on October the 8th in 2017, life gave you and your wife a very personal experience of PTS. So there you were, once again, having to find a new way to get back to your creativity and joy. So tell us a little bit about that experience.
Well, the previous year, I'd been writing this book, Mind to Matter, all about the link between our thoughts and reality and how our thoughts influence reality. And just simple things like, you have a stressful thought, your cortisol level rises, or you have an intention, and then how it can play out in the world around you. So I'd written this book, and it was just been completed. It was due for publication the following year. And so it was my big kind of project that year, 2017, was to write Mind to Matter. And then we, on that night, it was a fairly ordinary night, but we went to bed, and then at 12:45 a.m., my wife shook me awake. I looked at the alarm clock, blinking 12:45. I looked out the window, and there was a glow on the landscape outside, and a glow is not a good thing in Northern California at 12:45. So I walked outside, and there was a wildfire racing down the hillside opposite us toward our estate. We have a big piece of property, had our home, we had a beautiful home, we had an office building, many outbuildings, and I just yelled at my wife, "We're getting out of here right now. And normally my wife and I have a really placid relationship. So when I raise my voice, like, once every 5 years, she knows something's really important. And I was like, we're getting out of here immediately. We literally sprinted through the house, grabbed our car keys. And as we dashed for the car, there was this surreal landscape, like a snowstorm of cinders, embers blowing around us. And we got to the car and we drove out. And as we were driving out, there were just trees exploding in flames near us, around us, above us. And we just drove like crazy to get out of there. And so we wound up at some friend's house that night. We went out to the coast of Northern California, where we stayed for the next few days. And then a friend of ours, we wondered what had happened to the house. So a friend of ours found a way to get past the National Guard, which had cordoned off the whole city, because 5,400 homes had been destroyed that night. And so she sent us pictures of our house, and it looked like a bomb exploded. Everything was just black and gray and brown. There was no color left anymore. There were just concrete slabs where the garage had been, where the office had been, where the house had been. Just a chimney sticking up was all that remained of the house. The washing machine melted, the refrigerator melted. There's pools of metal around where those things had been, and ashes. So we knew then we had no house, we had no office, and we had to then start to think about what to do next. And we were ready to shell shock for a while. Our kids were so helpful. We have 5 kids between us, and they almost like treated us like kids. They're like taking me by the hand and saying, Dawson, now we need to walk you over here to the shelter to find some clothes, because I had no clothes at all. So they literally took me by the hand. I was like walking around like this man in a daze. That's what PTSD is. I mean, you just, after you're traumatized, you're disoriented. If you look at images, like early black and white photographs of men with shell shock after World War I, they look like that. They're wandering around. They're just totally, they're not in their bodies, and you aren't in your body. So we were in that state for a while. We then began to meditate again. We felt ourselves dropping back in and becoming resourceful as we meditated. But the whole of the next year was really difficult, because our office had been destroyed. Our business just tanked. And we went through all of our savings. We had no money. We then had 2 retirement accounts. And so we said, well, if we drain the one retirement account, we'll be able to then, we'll close the retirement account, take all the money out. They'll give us the money to function for the next year. And it only lasted a couple of months. And we had to drain the second account. Then we had to borrow. And by the end of the next year, we were about $300,000 in debt. I'd also had to have an operation. So here we were, amidst all of this, but we were meditating, we were tapping. And the crazy thing about it is that year we were living in a rental house, and we were trying to put together an insurance claim to get reimbursed by the insurance company for our lost possessions. And it was just what most people would think of as the year from hell. And yet I would wake up in the morning and like no retirement fund anymore, no retirement account, $300,000 in debt, can't make payroll. I'd sit there in meditation, and I'd open my eyes in an hour, and I would feel rich and abundant. I would feel absolutely wonderful. I'd write in my journal how abundant I felt my life was. So I became grateful and abundant, and I began hitting these highs. Now, we now know about this phenomenon called post-traumatic growth. And we also know from research that about 2/3 of people, when they hit a trauma like that, they actually don't collapse into PTSD. They actually ascend, and they actually become not only survivors, they thrive, and they have post-traumatic growth. And so we had an accelerated development of our spiritual and psychological lives in post-traumatic growth. And I found myself hitting these absolutely magical psychological highs every day, which every morning in meditation, which carried through into every day. And I began to write a new book, and that book was called Bliss Brain. So that book was written the year after the fire. And it's just this testament to post-traumatic growth. I began to ask myself, what's going on? How could I possibly be this happy in the face of such utter disaster, physical disaster, financial disaster? And the answer is that you find a sense of self that is beyond the local self. The local self is constructed by a part of the brain called the mid-prefrontal cortex. And when you're in the mid-prefrontal cortex, you're worried about my life, my job, my money, my body, myself. When you meditate, that part of the brain quietens down and you get away from what's called self-referential thinking. And your whole experience ascends to the kinds of places that the mystics write about. Rumi and Hafiz and Saint Catherine of Siena and Saint Francis talked about these mystical states of absolute bliss. And they didn't have easy lives. Many of these people were persecuted and had all kinds of losses. And in the middle of that, they were blissful too. And I've yet to look into the science of this and discover that there are these molecules of emotion. Serotonin is the same structure as psilocybin, magic mushrooms. And anandamide, another bliss molecule your brain secretes, has the same structure as THC. It docks with the same receptor sites in the brain as THC, the active ingredient in marijuana. Dopamine is tied into the dopaminic reward system, and you make lots of dopamine in certain styles of meditation, and that's cocaine and heroin. So there I am. I was sitting there after the disaster in my morning meditation, and I was basically like someone had given me a big squirt of ayahuasca and psilocybin and THC and all these other good things. And that's what happens in these blissful states. They then start to remodel our brains. So that was my year. And it was a remarkable learning experience for me. And I've been on fire ever since then to share this with other people, to let them know that your troubles, I know you were hurt by the pandemic. I know you were hurt by the economic crash. I know your marriage may not be all you'd hoped it would be. I know things are tough with your parent with cognitive decline, or your child who's struggling in school. I'm so sorry about that. And I want you to know that there's a version of you that you can find that transcends all of that, and you can then ascend to those levels in consciousness and meditation. And then the magic that happens is you bring them down to your everyday life, and that starts to change as well. So that was my 2018, and it really shifted the whole direction of my life.
Wow, I can just really feel your passion as you talk about it too. So did it literally take you a whole year to, I guess the word repress, so I don't, that's not the word, the trauma. Did it take you a year to get rid of the trauma or get you into this bliss or the next stage? I'm still learning all this, so I may not have the correct.
Yeah. It happens in stages. It happened in steps for me. So 2 days later, we were at the coast. We had gone to sleep the previous night, looking out at the sun setting, and it was setting in this just orange haze of all the soot, because all the air across the whole Bay Area was covered in soot. And I woke up the next morning. So this is 2 days after the fire, and I said to my wife, "It's an emergency. We have to sit up and meditate right now. We have to meditate right now." I knew we'd lost ourselves, and we sat there just 48 hours later, and we literally felt ourselves drop into our bodies. We then began to think about the fire and all the stuff we'd lost, many things we loved and treasured possessions, and a lot of stuff we actually hated. Like we had furniture we didn't like, which we'd been planning to get rid of. It's like, well, we've got rid of it now. I texted my office manager, she'd taken the photographs of the office, now all just ashes. I texted her and said, "Heather, guess what? Our goal as a company for the last 5 years has been the paperless office. And we've just gone entirely paperless. There's not a single sheet of paper left in the entire office." We backed up our computers 48 hours later. We had new laptops we were working on. So in 48 hours, we began to feel a sense of agency again. Now, it took us longer. We had a tap. I had several therapists. My therapist friends all clustered around to treat me. And we got a lot of good psychotherapy, good energy healing from people. And then the crucial point was a year later. On the anniversary of the fire, my dear friend, David Feinstein, Donna Eden's husband, did a long session with Christine and I on cleaning up all the residue of the fire. And that really, I think, to me, marked the end point of the processing of it. And as you can tell now, I'm talking about it, I'm laughing about it. But we were laughing about it pretty soon afterwards, because, you realize that there's one image that struck me. I have it in chapter 1 of Bliss Brain. And that is that when the office burned down, and the firemen estimated it took about 5 minutes for everything to be swept away in the flames. And they burned so hot that glass melted and metal melted, so everything, you couldn't tell where the desks had been or the file cabinets. But on the slab, the concrete slab where the office had been, there was just all this ash and debris. But there was one actual thing that had survived, and that was a ceramic statue of the Buddha, about a foot high. And what had happened was about 10 years before, somebody had stuck this statue into the back of a closet to store it. Then somebody else had dropped some file cabinets in front, files in front of it, some papers in front of it. And so we'd all forgotten for about a decade that the statue was there. And when everything burned down, the only thing left intact was this beautiful statue of the serene Buddha. And to me, that was the message of the fire, is that compassion, you can't burn that up. Love, if you have love for other people, if you have joy, if you have gratitude, nothing can burn that. Nothing can affect that. So that's the resilience in the subtitle of Bliss Brain, remodeling your brain for creativity, resilience, and joy. You're resilient, you're creative, and now you've got a brain that is that. You are that Buddha in the ashes. There are ashes all around you. The pandemic has taken somebody you loved. You are upset because of the loss in your retirement plan. You face financial uncertainty. And yet you are beyond all of that. You are this serene person in the face of unimaginable disaster. Viktor Frankl, World War II in Auschwitz, his whole family died. And yet he said, we have this choice to make about who we are. We are that being. We choose to be that core of self. And that is who I know all of us are, and we can choose to identify with that and live from that place. When you live from that place, tune to it every morning in meditation, let that place of inspiration live through you every day. You're no longer this weak, insecure, uncertain human being stumbling through life. You are the power and the presence and the passion of the universe pouring through a human body. That's the way to live.
And you show
That's when you become
Buddha. You show that picture of the Buddha in your book.
Yeah.
Yes. And that's when we become, as book, the genie in our genes.
Yeah.
When we accept
Our
that.
genes are changing as a result.
Yeah. Now, you've twice testified before congressional committees on your work, and we are hearing more and more about all kinds of alternative treatments for mental health issues. What is the future, do you think, of mental health treatment?
Future of mental health treatments is absolutely wonderful. And if you think about it, we've had this pandemic that we faced in 2020, and then we were facing a pandemic a century before that in 1918, 1919, with the Spanish flu, which killed a huge number of people, killed more people than World War I. And so back then, cholera and other diseases, polio, all of these diseases were killing huge numbers of people. Typhoid fever was an enormous killer of children, especially in urban areas where there were concentrations of people. So, when I talk about typhoid or cholera, these are names. We kind of know they were diseases, but to us, they have no emotional impact to them at all, because we eradicated them. And it took a small group of dedicated public health officials to eradicate them a century ago. And it's actually a very small group of people, and they faced a lot of opposition from entrenched interests at the time. But very, very quickly, those infectious diseases were swept away a century back, and we no longer have to worry about them. Well, guess what? It's now time for the same thing to happen with anxiety, depression, phobias, traumatic stress, all of these kinds of mental health issues that so compromise people's well-being. All of those are about to become history. We know from the research into EMDR, into EFT, into other somatic therapies, that it takes us 6 sessions to bring someone from clinical PTSD, flashbacks, nightmares, intrusive thoughts, insomnia, all of these problems. 6 1-hour sessions. I mean, 6 1 hours. That's all it takes. If you're paying your therapist $200 an hour, that's $1,200, and that stuff's just gone. That's what we've got. Now, we don't realize we got that cure yet on a worldwide scale. It's not like this is in every hospital yet, but it will be pretty soon. So the future of mental health is that there are these brilliant therapies. They're evidence-based. They're all, what they have in common is they are somatic. They work at the level of the body. You literally feel better in your skin, in your cells, after you've had a treatment with those therapies. And so what's going to happen is they're going to grow and become more popular, more widespread. They'll be found more and more in primary care, and so they'll catch on more and more. And within a century, like I'm visualizing, I have several grandchildren, and I imagine them, say in 2050, saying to me, "Granddaddy, I'm doing this college assignment on this thing called post-traumatic stress, but what is it?" They'll be as blank. Their faces will be as blank about anxiety and depression. They won't know anyone who's actually sort of depressed or traumatically stressed, just like we don't know anybody with cholera. So that's the future of mental health. We have these brilliant therapies. Right now, they face a lot of ridicule and they face a lot of repression, actually, but they're catching on. EFT is now approved by the VA as evidence-based treatment. It's finding its way into hospital systems. I talked to probably 10 doctors and nurses in the last week who are using it in their practices. They're using it for help, for their own self-care. They're doing it between patients to shed their stress. There's just been a randomized controlled trial published of nurses who got a COVID treatment after working in a COVID ward, and their anxiety declined dramatically. We now have a website called Tapping Place. On Tapping Place, you go get a virtual session. That's what these nurses got. They didn't even have a live therapist. They were just following along with an online therapist. And so we're finding now that online therapy, virtual therapy, can be very effective. And so it's going to work its way throughout the system. And I look forward to a day when I know I'll be traveling. If I'm still traveling when I'm 100 years old, which I hope to be, I know I'll be walking up to an airline gate. There'll be no security. No one would ever dream of bombing a plane or hurting anybody else. So I expect to see that in my lifetime. I might be wildly optimistic, but
I like your optimism. I like your enthusiasm. So, Dawson, why don't you show us how to do the tapping? I believe the audience would like that. Would you demonstrate?
Yeah, we have just barely enough time for a really short tapping session.
Okay.
And again, if you want to know more, we'll give you a website to go to download a free tapping manual. Go to tappingplace.com to work with a practitioner. But you can do a lot of it self-help without anyone's intervention at all. So start by thinking about something recent that bothered you, and it should be no more than 2 weeks old. So a recent event that bothered you. Don't think about a childhood trauma, because that's not an appropriate target for working on during a brief session like this. So you need to go work with a therapist on childhood trauma. Think about a recent adult event in the last 2 weeks. It could have been, a news story that bothered you. It could have been an interaction with a colleague or a friend or a family member. But think about an event, and then give it a title. If that was a movie, what would the title be? And then thinking about the title, rate it on that scale from 0 to 10, where 0 is no emotional charge and 10 is the maximum emotional charge. So what is your score on that scale from 0 to 10? So think of your memory, your movie title, and your number. And now just tap on these acupressure points, starting over here with me. And as you tap, think about the event, this bad thing that happened in the last 2 weeks. And also, you're safe right now. Right this very moment, you're listening to this program. There's no immediate threat to your survival. Right this very moment, you're safe. And in fact, you survived that bad thing that happened in the last couple of weeks. It didn't take your life. You survived, and you're safe right now. But it did happen. So focus on the event. Now tap on your governing meridian at the top of your head here. Just tap gently on the top of your head. Breathe. Think about the event. Again, you're regulating your energy system when you do this. So you tap on these acupuncture meridians. So it really happened. What did you see? What did you hear? What were the details? Tap on your eyebrow point, which is where your eyebrow meets the bridge of your nose. That's your bladder meridian. Again, thinking about bad event, tap on the side of your eye. That's your gallbladder meridian. Think about all the details of the bad event. Tap under your eye. What did you see? What did you hear? That triggered you emotionally. Tap onto your nose. Tap on your chin. That's your central meridian. This is exactly what we do with those veterans. We have them think about the events, and all they do is tap on them one after the other. It's all you have to do to release the energy and regulate your energy system. Tap on your collarbone, where it meets your breastbone. And the last point is under your arm, about 4 inches or 10 centimeters down. And then finally, one more time on the side of your hand. And then take a breath, think about the event again, and rate yourself on a scale of 0 to 10. And the chances are you'll have come down several points. Some people drop to a 0. Some people drop 2 or 3 points, but notice your new number. And you basically do it again if your number isn't down to a really low one. So if you're still, if you've gone from, say, a 7 to a 5 or a 7 to a 4, then tap again. You'll probably go down from a 4 to a lower number. So there's a lot more you can do with EFT. That's just a basic sense of how the routine works.
Wow. You give away a 60-page mini manual on your websites for people to do this for themselves.
Yeah, and that's one thing I really recommend you do. Download the mini manual. There's also an immunity boosting meditation on that same website, because we've shown that, again, this lowers cortisol, raises your level of immune antibodies. And so I made a special meditation that incorporates that research into about a 20-minute meditative routine you can follow along with. So all of that's on the website, and that website is just my name, DawsonGift.com. Just go there, download the manual, tap along for yourself, read about how EFT is done, and then make sure you use that immunity meditation, because it's powerful at raising your level of those antibodies.
We also have 2 chapters that you've generously given away to people from Bliss Brain. And if you can't remember all of the websites that I'm going to tell you about in a minute, go to Crack the Podcast website and you'll find all the links on Dawson's page there. But Rebecca, do you have a last question? We've only got a few seconds left.
Yes. Can you stay another hour?
Good question.
I'd love to.
I mean, this is fascinating. I have to say, I wasn't sure, but I'm open, and I'm just like,
You've been converted.
yes, that's the word.
Good.
Yeah. I mean, you feel it in your body. That's undeniable proof, and you literally feel the shift in your body.
Yeah.
Yes, I did when I did it last night. Yep.
There you go. She's the living proof of it.
Yeah.
How good is that? We're out of time now, but I just want to say you'll find links to access those 2-chapter excerpt from Dawson's book, Bliss Brain, on the Cracked the Podcast website. 60-page EFT mini manual. You've got the immunity eco meditation recording as well. And you can go to EFT Universe. You can go to DawsonChurch.com. You can go to Dawson Gift. You can go to the tapping place. You're going to have every domain on the internet. Spreading joy.
Full healing, physical and psychological.
I love it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Dawson, thank you for being with us. Thank you for your time. Love speaking with you.
You. A heart.
Yeah. Okay, that's all we have time for this week. We'll be back at the same time 2 weeks from now. Till then, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
And remember, there is a crack in everything. It's where the light gets in.
Thanks, Dawson.